Elliot woke up at 4:17 a.m. again. His throat was dry, his body stiff, and his mind hazy. He groggily glanced at the digital clock on his nightstand, its glowing red numbers searing into his vision. Third night in a row. Something was wrong. He sat up, rubbing his temples. He didn't remember falling asleep. He didn't even remember getting into bed. His last memory was brushing his teeth. Then, nothing. The uneasy feeling in his stomach grew stronger. He grabbed his phone and checked his messages. No texts, no calls, just silence. His fingers hovered over the security camera app. He hesitated, then tapped it. The footage loaded. Elliot's stomach dropped. There he was, standing at the front door at 3 a.m. He watched in stunned horror as the version of himself on the screen slowly reached for the doorknob, turned it, and stepped outside. For an hour, the doorway remained empty. Then, at 4:16 a.m., the door creaked open. Elliot walked back in. His movements were stiff, mechanical. His haze was vacant, his expression blank. And then, right before disappearing into the bedroom, he looked straight into the camera. Elliot caught his breath. The look wasn't passive. It wasn't empty. It was deliberate. Like he, or whatever had come back, knew he was watching. Elliot didn't sleep the next night. He set an alarm for 2:55 a.m. and waited, sitting upright in bed with his phone recording. At exactly 3 a.m., his body went cold. It was an unnatural sensation, like the heat had been sucked from the room. His vision blurred, and an overwhelming exhaustion hit him. He fought it. He clenched his fists, trying to keep his eyes open. His limbs felt heavy. His head drooped. His body wanted to move, but he wouldn't let it. Then, darkness. Elliot woke up, gasping for air. His clock read 4:17 a.m. His phone was on the floor, still recording. He grabbed it, breath heaving as he scrolled through the footage. At exactly 3 a.m., he stopped moving. His head slumped forward. Then his body stood up on its own. He walked stiffly, mechanically out of the bedroom. He fast-forwarded. An hour later, at 4:16 a.m., he came back. But he wasn't alone. Elliot's heart pounded as he stared at the screen. A shadowy figure, tall, thin, and very off, stood behind him in the doorway. it wasn't human. Its limbs were elongated, its fingers spindly and claw-like, and though its face was obscured, its head was tilted, as if watching him. Elliot swiped back to the previous night's footage. The figure had been there every single time, watching, following, waiting. Elliot checked the GPS on his phone. Every night, he had traveled the exact same path, straight to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. This time, he went there, awake. The building loomed under the streetlights, rusted and lifeless. He pushed open the heavy doors, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. Then, he saw them. Rows of footprints. His footprints, leading to the center of the warehouse. Elliot followed them, heart racing. In the middle of the floor, a circle had been carved into the concrete. Symbols surrounded it, deep and jagged, as if scratched by something not human. And in the very center, a pile of dirt, freshly disturbed, like something had been buried there. A sharp, metallic scent filled the air. Blood. His blood. He stumbled back, stomach twisting. His hands were shaking. He reached into his pocket instinctively and pulled out something he hadn't put there. A torn scrap of paper. It was old, edges crumbling, and on it, written in his own handwriting, were 3 words: "Do not dig." Elliot ran. He didn't stop until he was safely inside his apartment, doors bolted, curtains drawn. His mind screamed at him to forget, to obey the warning. But he couldn't. He needed to know what was under that dirt. That night, at 2:55 a.m., he grabbed a shovel and drove back to the warehouse. The air was thick, suffocating. The second his shovel hit the dirt, the temperature dropped. He dug. Each movement was met with resistance, like the ground itself didn't want him to know. Then, his shovel hit something solid. Elliot's hands trembled as he knelt, brushing the dirt away. A coffin. A small, rotting coffin. He hesitated, then pried it open. Inside was a body. His body. Dressed in the same pajamas he had been wearing every night, skin sunken, hollow, dead. Elliot staggered back, bile rising in his throat, his vision blurred, memories flooded back. He had been here before. He had been lured here before. That first night, the one he couldn't remember, he hadn't just walked away. He had died. Something had killed him. And yet, he had still woken up the next morning because something else had brought him back. Elliot turned, stomach twisting. The figure was there, tall, thin, smiling. It stepped closer. Its elongated fingers twitched. "You broke the cycle," it whispered. Elliot's breath stopped. He wanted to run, but his body was frozen. "You were meant to stay buried." The thing lunged. Darkness swallowed him whole. Elliot jolted awake. The clock read 4:17 a.m. His heart pounded. He scrambled out of bed, lungs burning. He was in his apartment. His room was the same, but something was wrong. The air felt empty, like something had been erased. He grabbed his phone, opened the camera app, pressed record. Slowly, he turned the screen toward the mirror. His reflection stared back. Then it blinked. A fraction of a second too late. Elliot's blood ran cold, because now the thing wearing his body knew he was watching.